Hi, everybody. Welcome to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 23rd, where we are in the midst of Oedipus the King. And as you know, one of the reasons why we begin with Oedipus the King is because of its cultural and historical importance. And from a cultural perspective, that means talking about Sigmund Freud, who was inspired by the play Oedipus the King to base his theory, the Oedipal complex, on the main character, which is Oedipus. Now, of course, now that you've read the play, notice I've made the assumption that you have finished reading the play, and you've also seen a production of the play, you know that the plot of the play is very different than Sigmund Freud's theory that boys have some sort of erotic attraction to their mothers and see their fathers as competition, romantic competition, that is. But there's enough of the story of Oedipus the King, a man who's given a prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother. And the irony is that in his attempts to prevent that prophecy from coming to fruition, he actually brings it about. There was enough in that so that we could see how Freud might have been inspired by that. And we know that this play from 430 BC was originally written in the Greek, so we are always reading translations or listening to translations. If you've got a translation in your text, I've got a translation from Project Gutenberg that you can access for free online. If you look in the notes below under the second section, you can see that particular link. The performance that we saw was a translation by William Butler Yeats, who happens to be a very famous poet. So, in that particular translation, there was a great attempt to keep to the poetic structures of the language. And this is always the challenge in a translation. How do you keep to the poetry, the musicality of the language, but also keep to the plot when you're translating? And that perhaps the specifics of the language is less important than just the generalities of the plot and the themes of the play. After all, as we talked about with the Greek amphitheater and some of the limitations associated with being able to see and hear a play in a Greek amphitheater, despite it being a marvel of acoustics, that the audience would know the plot ahead of time, which would be helpful so that if they missed a piece of the performance, they would still understand it. It's also helpful because Oedipus is probably one of the best examples of irony. In fact, I believe that if you were to look in your textbook under the definition of irony, the literary example they give you is of Oedipus the King. And from a historical perspective, Oedipus the King is so important because it lays the foundation of what a tragedy is, and that it was Aristotle himself, the great philosopher, who dabbled in literary criticism, who basically detailed the elements of what one should expect when watching or reading a tragedy. And that Oedipus the King, that particular play, was the finest example that Aristotle could identify of a tragedy. That you had a great man who was above and beyond the ordinary, someone that we could admire and respect, somebody above ourselves, who would experience some sort of downfall. And it makes sense that there would be a downfall because this is tragic after all. If it were not tragic, then perhaps there would be good fortune that would be involved. And that this downfall occurred in part because of outside forces, things that cannot be controlled by our actions. And in this particular instance, the word fate is used since Oedipus is fated to engage in particular behaviors, which leads to the question of what is fate? Is that just predetermination? Does that mean that we have no free will? Or is it just foreknowledge that something is known but we still have free will? Or is it some combination thereof? And the idea of fate, predestination, free will, or perhaps some of the language we use today, such as luck, all of those are questions that we grapple with. So that makes this play, in many senses, very contemporary. And that in addition to the outside forces, there's also an error, a flaw usually flaws made by the character. And this is the instructional element of the play, that we should not duplicate these character flaws because they help to bring about this terrible downfall. But as a good individual, above and beyond the ordinary, this person will accept responsibility for at least the part they played in their downfall. And we as audience will feel both pity for this major character, because after all, this was a good person. He didn't want a terrible thing to happen. He didn't consciously try to make a terrible thing happen. And we also feel fear that if this could happen to this person who is so superior to us, then it could certainly happen to us, and things would probably be much worse. And one of the lessons, of course, is not to engage in the character's flaws. And if we were to go through all of this with Oedipus the king, you can see that Oedipus fits very nicely into this particular definition. That Oedipus is a great man. In part, yes, he's royalty, so that already puts him above and beyond the ordinary. But more importantly, prior to the play itself, he's established his reputation as a great riddle solver. If you remember, he solved the riddle of the Sphinx. And ironically, this riddle of the Sphinx is basically the story of his life. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening? The answer being man. 4 legs in the morning would be a baby crawling. 2 legs in the afternoon would be an adult walking. 3 legs in the evening would be an old person with a cane. Now, Oedipus is not an old person at the ending of Oedipus the King, but he is literally blind and needs a walking stick. So he basically brings brings the riddle to life, if you will. One of the many ironies that we see within the play. And also, Oedipus is a good man. He puts the welfare of the populace above his own. Many times throughout the play, he indicates that the truth has to be revealed at all costs, even if he himself will suffer. Not that he in any way anticipates that he himself will suffer, but he does, and he is able to accept that. Remember that if Oedipus had decided not to pursue this riddle, the plague would have continued and people would have continued to die in the populace and to suffer. So this is Oedipus's responsibility as a good ruler, is to care for his people. And definitely Oedipus experiences a downfall. We see how ultimately not only is he dealing with the consequences of plague, but he has to deal with the consequences of incest and the loss of his kingdom. I'd say that's a pretty significant downfall. Outside forces for Oedipus the king, well, it would be the oracle and the question of fate, the prophecy. That if indeed a prophecy is, if you will, set in stone, then nothing Oedipus could do or not do would change that, which would make him very tragic indeed. That's not necessarily the way that the play would have been taken by Greek society. And we, in our modern day 2024 society, view Oedipus's greatest sin perhaps as incest. That's not the way it would have been viewed in Greek society. Oedipus's greatest sin is in trying to defy the gods. That Oedipus has been given a prophecy. Granted, it's a horrific prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother. And obviously, anybody who is a good person would try to prevent that. And of course, the irony is that in trying to prevent that, he brings it about. And this goes all the way back to Oedipus's birth parents. They make the same error. And it would be viewed as an error during Greek society that you should not try to question the fate that the gods have for you. Doing so would be the ultimate in arrogance, or hubris, Hubris, as it's known. And that is the sin that Oedipus' birth parents, happen to be guilty of, and that is the sin that Oedipus himself is guilty of. And the unanswered question we have in this play is, if Oedipus had never taken action after he was given the prophecy, would this prophecy have come true? And it's the same question we have of his parents. And That is probably the hardest part in terms of understanding Oedipus the King from a contemporary perspective, because any person would try to prevent this. And I know that I always respond to this play incorrectly when I'm reading it or watching it, because I'm looking for the loophole. I'm looking for ways that I can outwit the gods. Perhaps I'd never marry. Perhaps I'd never kill anybody so that I could prevent this terrible tragedy from occurring. But making that sort of plan would make me guilty of hubris, of arrogance, which should result in my downfall. That would be equally as horrific, if not more so, than Oedipus's, because Oedipus is a much greater and grander person than I could ever be. So, going to the idea of Oedipus's flaws. Oh, there are many. Definitely hubris and excessive pride, but there's also anger and the idea that he slays everyone in a crossroads. Or, as one of my former students put it, this perhaps is the first example of literary road rage that exists. Notice that's a crossroads that's both literal and figurative for Oedipus, and it's where three roads meet, each road signifying either Oedipus, his mother, or his father. So the symbolism in the play is significant, especially when we see themes of vision and blindness, which I'll get to in a moment. Definitely, Oedipus suffers from paranoia. The people he should trust, his brother in law, for instance, Creon. I love that in the version that we saw on YouTube. If you were watching with the closed captioning isn't always accurate. He's referenced as Crayon, and that's not his name. But you might have noticed the English pronunciation of Oedipus rather than Oedipus there. The version I had you see was a Shakespearean Canadian Stratford Festival production that tried to mimic what we might see in 430 BC Greece. And of course, we don't have eyewitnesses to be able to verify, but I just love the color imagery that was utilized in this piece. And obviously, we could see the big padded costumes and the platform shoes, and the use of the masks, and the use of the chorus chanting in unison, and the incredibly exaggerated movements. Keep in mind, if we were in a Greek amphitheater, none of this would seem quite so absurd. One of the problems I think with the production that I had you see is that we have to see it through a camera lens. Not necessarily a bad thing since we are in a literature and film class. The difficulty being that so often we get close ups, a view we would never have if we were seated in the audience itself. So we would be much further back. So the mass would not seem so odd, and certainly the exaggerated movements would not seem so exaggerated. I actually liken it to watching a silent film in some respects. But I love the color imagery that in the beginning, Oedipus is in gold, the royal color, and we see how Jocasta is in silver. Silver is also a precious metal, but it's beneath gold, and that would be appropriate for a queen. Creon is bronze, again, another precious metal, but not necessarily of the same distinction of gold or silver. We see how Oedipus's mask has black hollowed out eyes to illustrate that Oedipus doesn't have insight. When we are introduced to Tiresias, the blind prophet, he's all in white to indicate that he is indeed the light. He's trying to offer insight. And his eyes are completely blacked out. They're hollowed basically out in the mask to indicate that Tiresias is physically blind, even though he has insight. And then at the ending of the play, the costume changes that occur when now we see Oedipus in red. That denotes blood, the idea that he's gouged out his eyes, and also that he's guilty of a blood crime, which is what incest is a blood crime. The black veil to indicate that Oedipus is now blinded. The fact that Oedipus's children are wearing red, and again, they are the products of incest. Not that, again, we know for certain this is exactly the way the play would have been produced, but I think that this particular production takes great advantage of things like color imagery, the use of the incense to create this fog of not being able to see the truth, um, the use of the chorus all chanting at the same time, almost working as a kind of soundtrack, if you will. That moment in the play where we see Tiresias, Oedipus, and Jocasta all, or I'm sorry, where we see Oedipus, Jocasta, and Creon, I'm sorry, all on the stage at the same time. And that would have been an innovation of Aristotle's, where we would initially only have two actors on stage. The introduction of a third actor on stage adds complexity. Of course, this also adds challenges for a viewer if they were watching in a 14,000 seat Greek amphitheater far, far away where they could barely see the actors. So, again, keep that in mind in the production that we saw, that it tries to mimic what we would have seen in a Greek amphitheater. So that's why it seems so odd. In fact, I'll include a link here of another production. Not that you have to watch it, but I usually in my face-to-face classes show a few minutes of it, of this more contemporary production of Oedipus the King from the 1980s from the BBC, which is very respected. And you'll see that the actors are not wearing masks and they're wearing contemporary clothing, in fact, military uniforms. And it's just another interpretation. There are multiple interpretations for all of these plays. It's not that one is better than another necessarily. It's just a different viewpoint based on the director and the actors. So, but I thought it was important that we see the production that try to mimic what we might have seen historically. And historically, we know that Oedipus ultimately will accept responsibility as a tragic hero. Notice that he, in effect, punishes himself by gouging out his eyes. And of course, that's a horrific punishment, but it's also thematically appropriate. After all, his eyes have betrayed him. The major theme of the play is vision and blindness. Who can see or who can't see? This gets to perhaps, again, another of Oedipus's flaws, denial. Because how can somebody so smart, remember Oedipus is a great riddle solver, be so stupid and not see what's right in front of him? So anybody who's ever experienced denial or has seen denial in another, then you understand that this is a response to not wanting to see, because the truth is so horrific in this instance. So Oedipus does accept responsibility by gouging out his eyes. So he physically maims himself. And then he's put into exile, which would be seen as a fate almost comparable to death. And as audience, we feel pity and fear. Pity because Oedipus was a good man, after all, and he tried to prevent this horrible thing from happening. And fear, because if this could happen to Oedipus, it can happen to us, and it could be much worse. And the moral lesson on the most simplistic of levels, don't engage in some of the same flaws that Oedipus engaged in, such as hubris or anger or paranoia or denial. Jocasta can never be a tragic hero. Yes, she is royalty, but keep in mind she never solved the riddle of the Sphinx. More importantly, she's not concerned with the populace. When she comes to the point of figuring out the truth, and in the production that we saw, we can see the actor actually move their head to indicate that a realization has occurred. I don't know if that's exactly the moment where the truth comes to Jocasta. Again, there's a lot of interpretation that's involved with the play. But nevertheless, we do know that she figures out the truth before Oedipus. Again, illustrating just how much denial Oedipus is in, because how could you not see the truth by this point? And Jocasta's response to Oedipus is to leave things alone and not to ask questions. In other words, she'd rather have the populace suffer and continue to die than to sacrifice her own nuclear family. This is why she can never be a tragic hero. Nor does she accept responsibility. She commits suicide at the very ending of the play. And that would be seen at the time as an act of cowardice rather than living with the consequences of her actions. Creon, and note that these characters are not terrifically developed. They don't have the layers of nuance that we'll see with more contemporary characters. But we're in the early days of drama. He's more of a representational figure, an allegorical figure, if you will. He represents reason, rationality, generosity. Um, and ironically, even though Creon is accused of trying to steal the kingdom, and Creon responds, "Why would I want to do that? I have all of the privileges of being part of the royal court with none of the responsibilities of being king." Ironically, it's Creon who becomes the king at the ending of the play, and shows Oedipus mercy by allowing Oedipus to say goodbye to his children, specifically the girls. And Oedipus is particularly concerned with the girls because at least the boys will be able to fend for themselves economically. The girls have to rely on marriage to fend for themselves economically. And who will marry the products of incest? So that's why he has particular concern for the plight of his female children. And I think I had mentioned that Oedipus is part of a three-part story. We're reading only the first. I believe you've got the second part, Antigone, in your textbook. And the third, if you don't have it in your textbook, Oedipus at Colonus. Certainly you can find it online. And basically, the story continues after Oedipus is exiled, even though we will not continue with the story. Antigone, the second play, is the story of one of Oedipus's female daughters, who's now an adult. And Creon is still king. Many years have passed by this point. Creon is a very different kind of king in the second play, Antigone. Creon is filled with excessive pride and anger and paranoia and denial. Sound familiar? He's basically much like Oedipus. So Creon is changed in the second play, leading to the question of how does power change an individual? Or does absolute power corrupt absolutely? Because we know that Creon wasn't like that in the first play. The third play, Oedipus at Colonus, is a play that returns back to Oedipus now as an old man. So many years have passed. Of course, he's blind and wandering in exile with his walking stick. The question is, has he appeased the gods enough so that he can be forgiven for his sins of hubris? And I won't tell you. You'll have to read or watch the performance of the play. So, Tiresias, as we know in the play, is just supposed to represent a blind prophet, which is ironic because Tiresias can't see physically, which illustrates that in order to have true insight, you don't need your eyes. So the chorus we know represents both the populace, which is the society, and also can serve as a kind of narrator, commenting or reflecting upon the action. And they're all engaged in similar actions, and their chanting serves as almost like a musical score. It also is, of course, of increased volume because you have multiple people chanting at the same time. And in terms of themes for the play, certainly vision and blindness is a major theme in this particular play. Light and dark, and that's one of the things I like about the production that we saw. I think they utilized shadow really nicely and the idea of light and dark. Obviously, they were using stage lights, something that would not have happened in a Greek amphitheater. They would have had to rely on natural light. And, of course, irony. Perhaps the best example of irony that I can think of from a literary perspective. The questions of fate versus free will. Family, I think, is quite interesting because the idea is that a ruler should see their community, the populace, as their family, which is what Oedipus does. So Oedipus has his nuclear family, obviously, his biological family, but he also has the community. And we see how Jocasta is willing to sacrifice that family, the community family, to protect her nuclear family, something that Oedipus won't do. All of these might be possibilities for paper topics, but for your second paper, which I will be distributing soon, is going to basically be a repetition of what you did with your first paper. I'm going to give you the possibility of either talking about canon, whether something should or should not be included in the canon, or contemporary relevance, whether something does or does not have contemporary relevance, or you can create your own essay topic, as long as it's based on one of the dramas and you have it approved by me ahead of time. So your three dramas are Oedipus the King, which we are in the midst of now, A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is what's coming up, and then ultimately A Raisin in the Sun. And also with a rolling deadline that you can hand in that paper early, but you've got up until the ending of the semester, which means that when we are at the ending of the semester talking about poetry, there wouldn't be time for you to write a paper. which is why the final exam, the last day of class, will be mostly devoted to poetry, 80 points, where I'm going to just ask a series of essay questions. It will be an open book, open note exam, so it's not something that you have to memorize. And based on the poems that we read in class, those will be the options that you could use to respond to one of those essay questions. And I certainly don't expect anything as developed or as detailed as what you would write with the paper. After all, if we were doing this in a face-to-face situation, you would have approximately 2 hours. Because it's an online situation, you would have 24 hours to do that final examination. But you still should be able to synthesize some of the major points that we've put together in terms of poetry by that point in the semester. Though the reality is that we're going to start talking about poetry very soon. If we haven't already, Oedipus was written in poetry, though of course we're reading in translation. Shakespeare's all about poetry, even though we're reading a drama. And I told you what's ideal, though the world isn't always ideal, that when we are talking about a drama, you would have read it in its entirety. So what would be ideal is that you have already read Oedipus the King in its entirety, and you are reading our next drama, which is A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I was luckily able to find the link online, which I've included in the notes below as well, so that if you don't have access to the textbook, you can find that information. And as we are discussing Oedipus the King, and yes, we will watch performance as well, you are reading the last play of the options that you have, which is A Raisin in the Sun. And of course, we'll also see a performance of that and talk about that. In terms of your first paper, you are in, as I call it, the queue for for those of you who've submitted in that paper, that I evaluate the papers based on first come, first serve. So basically in the order of receipt. It'll take me a little bit of time to get those papers back to you. But certainly, that said, you all have the option of rewriting that paper for a higher grade. You just need to incorporate my suggestions into your revision and submit in the original evaluated copy along with your revision by the last date of class. And certainly you'll have your paper back before the last day of class. And certainly you'll have your paper back before your second paper is due as well. The idea is that the first paper is a learning exercise so that you can incorporate those elements into your second paper. So I'm working on those papers, the hope being that you can read my handwriting as you receive your papers back. So certainly if it turns out that you can't, let me know and I'll be happy to translate for you and even go through the comments, comment by comment, if you so wanted me to. So at this point, I'm hopeful that you've put some closure onto Oedipus the King, even though we haven't necessarily put some closure onto it, and that you're reading A Midsummer Night's Dream. I'm well aware this is not a Shakespeare class, even though I teach Shakespeare, so I see this as an introduction to Shakespeare. You may or may not have had some introduction to Shakespeare before, but I wanted to talk a bit about Shakespeare. Unfortunately, the readings that I had assigned to introduce us to Shakespeare I have not been able to find online because of copyright issues with our textbook, though certainly you can find lots of information about Shakespeare on your own. And I'm going to basically fill you in on the major points of what that reading was about before we actually view a production of the play and then talk about the actual play itself, Midsummer. And when we get to Raisin in the Sun, I think you'll find it to be a much easier read and watch. It's much more contemporary, and it's from the United States as opposed to England from the late 1500s or 430 BC Greece. But as I had indicated, we haven't really finished yet with Oedipus the King. I've talked quite a bit with Oedipus the King, but for today's attendance question, I thought what you could do was identify an important quote in Oedipus the King and indicate why it's important. So that will be due by Friday the 25th. Of course, if you need an extension, let me know. And you're not necessarily required to respond to your peers, but you are encouraged to do so. What you are required to do is to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you an idea of what we would have talked about in class. So I will leave you with identifying a quote with Oedipus the King, and then we'll put some closure onto that and move forward to Shakespeare next class. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we'll continue on next week. Take care. Bye bye.